Thanks, Mike. It was funny, after the service this morning, I had a bunch of people asking me what I did with the water balloon because they had a target in mind. Yeah, I need that, Dave. You know, if we're going to be a Bible preaching church, I might need a Bible, you know. One of them was my son, and I'm not going to try to assume who his target might have been. But I'm sure Father was in the list. All right, well, let's dive back in to the book of Esther tonight. And as we plow our way through this, this is a tricky section because in just the first couple of verses, you end up with a lot of crazy things going on. You've got an overtone of basically just Eastern mindset regarding sexuality and how that all works together and how that worked in the harems and how that worked in these pagan nations. And it's odd because we throw Hebrews into the mix of this, which are obviously not accustomed to those kinds of things other than their captivity sections. And then you kind of have some things going on with some spies, and then we see the selection process along the way. I'm going to skip through all these because we did all those already. Remember, we're talking about a huge area. Don't let that ever drop out of your mind, how big of an area is being influenced by what's going on. Primarily, all of this is going on here, which is the Winter Palace here in Persepolis is the kind of the main, that's the main, what I want, castle, I guess would be a word that comes to mind. It's not quite what I want. Palace, there we go. So you've got that there, but this is all taking place at the Winter Palace. This is where these banquets have been taking place. It does because of when the seasons are structurally unfolding. So that's part of what's going on here. And then just a reminder, none of these areas have been in the news in the last 2 weeks. We haven't seen any of these names in the last 2 weeks in the news. We've seen Syria and Iran and Iraq, and all of them have been mentioned in the news with what's going on. And right now looking at the alliances that are being made with China and the things that are unfolding that way with these already troubled areas. But you know, somebody asked me if I was sure about this. Is that really part of China? And the answer is, yeah, it really is part of China. But that's just how far to the east the Persian Empire was during this time. I'm going to skip that. I'm hoping this video works this week. It is.
In modern-day Iran lies the ancient city of Shushan, known as Susa in English renderings of the Bible. Susa is the site of the famous story of Queen Esther. Its palace was also home to biblical Nehemiah and was envisioned by the prophet Daniel. Excavated for almost 100 years, the site of Susa has revealed her ruined Persian palace and royal city, showing students of the Bible that the book of Esther must retain eyewitness reports of its function and layout. Today, some of the decorative palace remains are stored in the Louvre, including a foundation inscription that records where all the luxury building materials were brought from. The royal palace of Susa was built by Esther's father-in-law, Darius I, known to history as King Darius the Great. Darius constructed Susa as a winter capital of the Persian Empire. Here, he constructed a massive 12-acre terrace, upon which he built his monumental palace, connected to the city of Susa by a large gate known in Esther as the King's Gate. To access the palace compound, one would have to cross a bridge over a river and walk through the King's Gate into a large courtyard outside of the palace. This system of the palace complex being separated from the city proper is reflected in the book of Esther that distinguishes between the city of Susa and the citadel of Susa that should be identified as the palace complex. Inside the palace, the royal banquet hall has been identified. It was a pillared room whose elaborately decorated columns were 65 feet tall. This banquet hall saw the infamous feast of Xerxes when he drunkenly requested Queen Vashti's presence. It was also a main place of Nehemiah's work as cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. The very spot of the king's throne in this banquet hall has been identified by its stone base centered between the pillars of the room. The palace itself was organized in a more Babylonian style, incorporating 3 main courtyards that created a grand walkway through the palace on the way to the king's throne room. These courtyards would have been decorated with stone reliefs and glazed bricks, and they were separated by guardhouses. The Book of Esther indicates that the outer courtyard was the place that royal officials would come with their business and wait to be summoned by the king, as Haman providentially did. From the layout of the palace, it's easy to see that the king's throne, located in his great hall or throne room, would have had a direct line of sight to the inner courtyard, where Esther is said to have illegally come to request an audience with her husband. Esther herself would have come from the women's quarters, through the palace's middle courtyard, and into the inner courtyard, a route that can still be walked by modern visitors to Susa. Thanks for watching. Click the playlist on screen now to watch more spotlights.
Sorry,
and if you want to
you're not
read the
gonna watch
full
anymore.
article, click the link in the description.
So
You
I
can
wanted
always
you to
go
get
Bible Discovery.
another look at what we're talking about here, because what I liked about this particular video, it really begins to help you understand the layout of where everything's going to flow through. I mean, 60-foot pillars. I mean, that doesn't. What are we in here? Come on, some of my math people, 20 feet at most. So 15, so quadruple it. and you're talking these massive structures. And that's just pretty incredible to think about. So let's dive back into Esther chapter 2. We've kind of already gotten a little bit started, but we're looking at the selection process here. And we're looking at the quote-unquote heroine of the book as she comes to light in our text. We're going to talk a little bit about what some of that meant as we unwrap this. So after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what he had done, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom." Let's just pause right there. There are some modern writers who would like to instigate that this really wasn't a nationwide search. I'm not reading this wrong when it says that in officers in all the provinces of his kingdom. So we weren't talking about 20 or 30 women that are being gathered here. Remember, China to Greece. I mean, we're talking that much area that is getting covered where these girls are being recruited from. That they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, not Haggai, but Haggai. Don't get them confused. Haggai's a eunuch. Haggai was not. The custodian of the women. He was in charge. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young women who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. So we've got like a little kind of story, and then we're going to go and retell the story a little bit further. So this takes a turn into what we are more familiar with. In the first chapter, there's no mention of Israel, no mention of Israel's place in salvation history. The effect is somewhat disconcerting when you think about the vast majority of the Old Testament focuses on God's relationship with Israel. And then we throw this book in the middle of all this, and we're focusing primarily on a pagan nation who is part of the overall bringing back Israel to, again, remember we said that Mordecai and Esther really should have been back in Israel. They shouldn't have been staying in Persia anyway, but they did. And so we meet our protagonist, I guess would be a good word. We meet Esther. We're going to meet Mordecai in a minute. And we get this idea. A.B. Simpson, which some of you guys who are our CMA friends might recognize that name. He was the Christian Missionary Alliance theologian, said, God is preparing his heroes. And when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. And again, that's that sovereignty of God, free will of man. Esther and Mordecai obviously exerted some free will to stay in Persia, but yet God was already working and putting people into place for what is going to ultimately rescue part of the remnant. Dr. Simpson also added that God does prepare his heroines, for certainly Esther was divinely prepared for her role as what would be the new queen. And then the thing to kind of remember is God is never surprised by our circumstances or the lack of preparedness of people to be used. I don't think Esther was preparing to be used. I think Esther was enjoying kind of a quiet life with Uncle Mordecai, and they were doing their thing. I don't think she said, ooh, it'd be nice to live in the palace someday and be one of the many women that the king enjoys. I don't think that was on her list of things to be involved in. But yet, God was preparing her. Think back to other characters. You think of Joseph, ends up in Egypt and rescues the remnant again. Ezekiel, Daniel in Babylon, Nehemiah later here in the same region. And we're seeing God always keeping his people. And you're going to see the hand of God at work in the affairs of people. Just because God's name is not mentioned in this book does not mean he is absent from the book. And it's funny because everybody says, well, you have to look really hard to find God in the book of Esther. Can I beg to differ? I don't think you have to look that hard. I think you can see it as it unfolds. This unit kind of falls into three sections. The first section, the servants of the king, are the one that propose a replacement for Queen Vashti with someone who would be, how shall we say, more biblical word, submissive. Another word, controllable. Vashti was not controllable. And so the servants proposed that beautiful young virgins from all over the kingdom be gathered to basically, I'm sorry, I don't want to make this any crasser than what it is. They're going to compete for the king's attention. And it is more than a beauty pageant. This is not just about the beauty and things that are going on. It is very much about who pleases the king. And I don't want to go further than I have to, but you need to understand that I'm not talking about who cooks the nicest. This is deeper than that. Each girl is going to spend one night with the king, and the one who pleases him most is going to become the queen. Dr. Fox, another commentator, bluntly states, this is not a beauty contest, it's a sex contest. That sounds harsh, but it's a reality. How on earth would Esther find herself in this situation? A Jewish girl who's been taught purity, a Jewish girl who's been raised to marry young and to stay with her husband, a Jewish girl who has been taught modesty, is now going to enter into a contest in which sexuality is going to be the primary issue at hand. I don't know where Esther's mother is at this point. We do know that she's not around, presumably by death. But let me tell you something. If Mama was around, there wouldn't be an ant in all of Persia that didn't know that she was unhappy with what was going on with her girl. This would have been a big deal. The method is pretty unorthodox, to say the least. Normally, a queen is chosen from the aristocratic families. We've talked a little bit about this before. You're wanting to reaffirm political alliances. Some people, like I shared, I'll repeat myself on a few things just so we keep it in our head, that part of the harem of the king are leadership's daughters of all these various regions spread out across the land who have been brought into the king's palace as wives, as concubines. And it was a political thing, because if you don't behave over there, I'm going to take care of your daughter. And you're not going to like how I'm going to take care of her. So it was a manipulation tool as well as an aristocratic. Xerxes' own mother was a daughter of Cyrus the Great. But under the circumstances, maybe this method could be considered appropriate. Vashti's lost her position. She has not shown proper submission, proper servitude. We've spent our fair amount of time talking about that. And her replacement, I don't think it would have mattered who she was. I don't think anybody's going to try to repeat what Vashti did at this point. I think, you kind of learned your lesson in this experience. So that's kind of the first section. The second section, we really get into Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's adopted father, and he's a Jew. He's of some standing. He's descended from the family of King Saul. His cousin, first introduced as Hadassah, is kind of a figure of tragedy. She's an orphan. She's utterly dependent upon the goodwill of other family, or would have been at the hand of the social system, but I hate using that word because it's very different than what our current social system is. But she was taken in by Mordecai. She becomes kind of the epitome of a beautiful daughter, not just physically beautiful, but the impression we have is that they have a good relationship and she's submissive to his leadership as she would with a father. We'll see that unfold later. The third and the largest section has one author described it as a pleasant literary quality about it. One of the reasons that people enjoy the book of Esther so much is it's a good read. It's just a good read. It's an easy read once you get around some of the names of some of these crazy people. But other than that, it's an easy read. But we're told detail about the gathering of the virgins, their preparations for the night. The focus is in on Esther and the favors that she receives from the chief eunuch, as well as eventually the king. The author of the book described the preparations in remarkable detail, including 12 months of treatments with perfumes and cosmetics. We'll talk about that a little bit, girls. This wasn't a walk into Macy's perfume counter and get a couple spritzes. This wasn't schedule yourself for a quick makeover at some makeup store. This was a process, girls, and it's quite detailed. But for the actual night when the maiden is taken to the king, there's nothing. We have no details. It just drops off. And you're saying, well, we don't need to know all the nitty-gritty details. We know what the purpose of this thing is. Yeah, but I understand that. I don't need the sexual details, but I really kind of need to know what happened. And what did Esther say? What did Esther do to win his heart in a way that the other women did not? And I don't think it was necessarily just her physical beauty or her physical prowess. We're kind of left to guess guess as to what it was that Esther did that made the king so profoundly turn towards her. Have any of you guys seen One Night with the King? So it's a version of this story, and they kind of do some funny things about that night with the king, that something happened, that he did not have intimacy with her, and that is a unspoken, unknown thing. I can't tell you whether or not did something happen that made him treat her with respect all of a sudden, which would be difficult for me to wrap my brain around unless God was very much involved, because that's what he did. He's already got a number of wives. He's already got a number of women at his service, if you will. And the whole unit is really self-contained and characterized by some beautiful symmetry, and you kind of have this little kind of inclusive statement in chapter 2 and verse 4, when you have this, let her be made queen in the place of Vashti. And then at the end, we have, and she was made queen in the place of Vashti. So you see this beautiful literary sandwich you got here. So verse 4, that's the top of the bread or the bottom of the bread, whichever you prefer. And verse 17 is the other side of the bread. And there's all this meat that's going on in between there. And we're left with, did y'all ever have mystery meat when you were in school? I don't know. When I was in school and you had school lunches, we were pretty sure some of what they were feeding us was not really meat. But we made some assumptions, so it was mystery meat. I think my mother served a few of those dishes as well. So as we looked at these first 4 verses, some people have said this is the Miss Persia beauty contest. The opening line is, again, reminding us of everything we've talked about. It's a sometime afterward. We run into this phrase that shows up in chapter 3 and verse 1. The time that has passed is kind of unspecified. It is pointed out to the date in chapter 2, verse 16. Esther is not taken to Ahasuerus until 4 years after Vashti's removal. So we have some idea of some specifics. That's a long time for a country, a ruling party, to be without a queen. Usually if a king was without a queen that long, there was something wrong with the king. Whether it was disease, which was a problem in this time period, whether it was he was a jerk, and every one of them either ran away, some killed themselves in this culture rather than be with a king. You're saying, is it really this bad? Yes, it's really this bad. It's really this ruthless. It's just hard for us to wrap our brain around, because in Western culture, that's not the way it happens. My future son-in-law schedules a meeting with me and says, I kind of like your daughter. And I'm like, yeah, I think you do. What do you want? And I made it as difficult as I possibly could for him to get the words out of his mouth. But he was asking me for permission to marry my daughter. That doesn't fit in this mindset. Remember, even within Israel, arranged marriages were part of their system. And there was some choice involved. My Jewish friend told me one time, he says, would you quit making it sound like the mom and dad had the whole choice in the matter? The kids did get a voice, it just wasn't a very loud one. And so, okay, there we'll say that. So we have 4 years that have passed, and during that time, Ahasuerus, as he's directed his attention towards Greece. He's had an ill-fated campaign. He's come home in humiliation. He was defeated at Salamis in 480 BC. And for 2 of these years, the king was fighting with the Greeks. You have a 2-year war going on during this 4-year hiatus. That might have had something to do with why there was not a queen being sought after. I mean, if the king's away at war, kind of hard. Hey, would you like to marry the king? He might not come home. We'll have to wait and see if he wins, if he dies, if whatever. It's kind of an odd situation. And we spent some time talking about him processing all of these things. And we get into this, and we read that Esther has a year of cosmetic treatments So presumably 3 years or so passed between Vashti's disappearance and Esther's entrance. So it's in that last year, or it could have been in the 5th year. There's some debate over that. I personally think it fits within the 4-year timeline. Her arrival seems to follow fairly shortly after this decree to go out and gather the virgins. You say, wait a second, how did that happen? I mean, come on, that's a lot of territory to cover to get the language out. I can't put the map back up there, but if you remember, there's a highway type thing that ran all the way from Persepolis all the way out to Greece. There was a major byway, and so it wasn't like sending a text, but it was timely. And so we see all of this unfolding, and we begin to try to answer a few questions. We see that they say, let the beautiful young virgins. So the men were being men. You know, they didn't say, go out and find the virgins that look the worst and look the worst for wear, and, you know, find some that, you know, nobody else will have. It was very targeted. And so even in the selection of these women, and this is where I think the number could be strewn just a little bit. Because Ron's going to go over here to this village. Sorry, Barb. Ron's going to go over here, and he's going to look at the group of women over here, and he's going to pick what he thinks is beautiful and fits this category of virgins. And Tony, he's going to go back there. Sorry, Carol. And he's evaluating all the women back there. And Tony likes a totally different kind of woman than Ron does. And they've got their own opinions of what makes something beautiful. It's always been funny to me going on mission trips with teenagers to who gets marriage proposals while we've been on these trips. The blondes and usually the Italians. Those were the two people that always got offers while we were in these foreign countries. And so you've got this idea that there was some selection going on, so it probably wasn't every virgin from all over the area. So there was some form of selection going on. And the narrative kind of rolls upon itself to try to understand this. The cosmetic treatment's taking a whole year. It could be as late as the 6th year that Esther could have been brought in. I think it was more towards the 4th to 5th year, but that's my opinion on the matter. It's interesting, and I didn't bring this out before because Ralph did an amazing job helping us really understand what Xerxes had going on in his head. But the phrase that he remembered is actually a very much a Hebrew phrase. It is remembering the God of your fathers, remembering the God of David, remembering the God of Jacob, Isaac. This is a very common Hebrew word that is kind of pushed into Persian culture. There are all kinds of things that have gone on. He's moving on to find a new wife. The Septuagint inserts a negative here and says he no longer remembered Vashti, what he had said and how he condemned her. Ralph did a good job. I think that's exact. I have a whole new understanding for what his mind went through. Josephus, who was who? Who's Josephus? He's a Jewish historian. Are his books canonical? Do they belong in the Bible? No, but they're an immense resource for history. Immense resource. The works of Josephus are. He seems to understand that he thinks that the king was kind of pining over his lost queen. And he's doing all of this out of love sickness, and somebody reminding him that, you got to get over this love sickness. There's a lot of fish in the sea. You can go out there and find anybody you want. That doesn't fit with my mind either, and the understanding. But there is this decree that comes out, and it's interesting that Xerxes does not really formulate his own response. Did you catch that? Now, I'm not thinking this guy's dumb at all. You don't conquer militarily and otherwise this whole region and be sleight of mind. I think he was a smart man. I think he was a brilliant man, especially picking up on the architecture and things that were carried forward of what he was entrusted with. But this is going to happen repeatedly throughout the book. You're going to find out that people speak on Xerxes' behalf in a lot of instances. And that's why it will become so interesting when Esther comes into the throne room, nobody tells him what to say. All of a sudden, he has something to say. Interesting that sneaks in there after we've got all these people speaking on his behalf. And all these guys are kind of evidently eager to help out. And so we've got this idea, they've got this campaign, they've got it all put together. And it's interesting. So a midrash is a commentary, and it's constructed this dialogue this way for chapter 2, verse 1 and following. When he recovered from his wine, he sought her. They said to him, "You had her killed." He said to them, "Why?" They said to him, "When you said that she should appear before you naked and she didn't come," he said to them, "I didn't act correctly. Who advised me to have her killed?" And they said to him, "The 7 ministers of Persia and Media." And he immediately killed them, and that's why they're not mentioned again. Now, do you see a few jumps in logic here? There's all kinds of jumps of logic. Remember there's 7 names that are mentioned? Well, they aren't mentioned again in the book. So you got these Jewish commentators are going, we've got to explain this somehow. We can't leave anything unexplained. That's what rabbis do. Somebody's got to figure out what somebody said or somebody didn't say, and you'll figure out who agrees with who, and you're trying to explain every little detail. And that's why there's so much additional rules within even modern Judaism. So again, this is unprecedented. She is not a noble. She is not of any of the Achaemenid rulers. The purity of the royal line is about to be quote unquote tainted. The procedural descriptions here are just crazy. It would make more sense for him to have elevated one of his concubines. That would have made more sense than to do what these guys suggested. Please read the word virgin for the word virgin. I commented on this before, and I had a couple people ask me a question, and how did they know? Well, one would have been by reputation. Another would have been by word of the Father, but there was also medical means to evaluate this. And so I don't know how far this process went into all that. If the father stated that, yeah, this is my daughter, she is a virgin, and then she got in with the king and she wasn't, that would have been pretty bad. So take the word for what it is. Some people have tried to retranslate this word and say she was a young maiden. I think she was a young maiden, but she also was what the king was looking for. My question before we get into these beauty treatments is, do you think that these women were forced to participate? Or did they have an option? Yep, those are good thoughts. Very much so. Most of the dramatic versions I've seen of this all picture it as nobody had a choice. They were drug away, so to speak. Drug away and forced to go through all of this stuff. Whether it was, as Amanda said, because, hey, living out here isn't so nice. Living in there's got its perks. So let's go for it, especially for the rest of the Persian community, not necessarily for the Jews. Esther's not the only Jew living in this community. And see, we got the idea, in our minds that Esther and Mordecai are the only ones that stuck around here in the region. No, there were others that stuck around in the region. We know that because what is going to be the problem later in the book? They're trying to wipe out the Jews in the kingdom. So we know there were other Jewish, and there would have been other Jewish young women as well in the community. It's one of those kind of nice things to think about, but we don't really need to know the answer. The basic idea in this culture is marriage was not a romantic idea, it was a business arrangement. A man needed a wife to bear children so that he would have heirs and so that the line would stay in the mindset. It wasn't so much about having the genes, but having the same design in mind of what the predecessor had. It was you were going to carry out. And if you had a wild child, you would find ways to assign him other duties, other tasks along the way. Love in these relationships really implies an emotional bond. Did love occur in these relationships? I think absolutely it would have, but nothing like what we in our Western culture think of as love. It just wasn't that way. Go back to your Fiddler on the Roof, guys. He's sitting there with his wife, and what are they doing? Do you love me? Do I love you? And for 25 years I've done this and this and this and this and this. And this. Well, I guess I do. You have to understand it's not the same way as what our mind says of love. And so the question that gets begged here is, does Ahasuerus fall in love with Esther? I think there's indicators that she was definitely special. It's very interesting. Yeah. Some commentators say the reason he didn't choose from the current is because they would have had Vashti's influence and they didn't trust her. So they had to get new blood to come in and do things the right way. Subservient, listen, mind, do what you're told. When you're asked to come to a banquet, show up. And Vashti would have had ruling authority over all these other women. So it's possible she could have had some kind of influence there. You would have had a very wide, various levels of melanin, as far as color of skin, cultural, yeah. There could have been some concerns regarding that. When we get down to verse 3, they're taken from all these providences. So as Amanda's talking, we're talking about various ethnic groups, various cultural backgrounds, various distinctives. And if you've ever had your kids marry, you know that your children always marry weirdos because they don't do things like your family does. They've got their own way of doing things, and they're creating a new home over here. And you're like, that's not the way we did it. And it's just wrong. No, but think the same way, but now think of food choices, clothing choices, ideas about society, ideas about getting along in family. All of that is playing out in grand chaos scheme. It was going to be exceptional for the Queen of Persia to be a non-Persian. That's going to come into play later, but not right now. even if we deal with Herodotus' claim, which he's one of the ones that claims that the queen was only taken from one of the 7 noble Persian families, these 7 guys that disappear, that it's one of their, that's where it should have happened. It didn't happen that way. Herodotus is not necessarily reliable, but we do have some help with some history and geography. The women are going to be triply secured for the king's pleasure. They're going to be brought into the citadel. They're going to be locked up in the house of women. They're going to be placed under the watchful eye of the eunuch, a man who has no interest in women. That's why he was allowed to be around them. It's kind of, this is going to sound a little crass, but I don't have another way. It's kind of the king's playground, so to speak. These are all just toys. They're not relationships. They're not special in this moment. This is a special quarters in the palace. It is reserved for the king's wives, and there would have been a section that would have been reserved for the concubines. And that particular video didn't mention it, but they believe that they have uncovered what they believe on the northwestern corner of the complex. They believe this is the ideal spot for where these women would have been kept along the way. And so we're appointing these officers. They're going around. They're doing all these things. And then you get to verse 4, and you read, "Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." Well, let's talk a little bit about these cosmetic treatments. Cosmetic treatment number 1, scrub deeply, preferably 2 to 3 layers of skin. Got to get rid of the disease. Got to get rid of anything else, any impurities. Got to get rid of the calluses. Got to get rid of everything possible. It was a scouring match, girls. I mean, probably, when David says, "You purge me with hyssop and I shall be clean," hyssop is the precursor to the scouring pad. That's exactly what it is. It's what they used. And it's rough, it's coarse, and it would have been rubbed across these girls' skin. Think like a loofah, but made of copper iron, woven amongst itself. You know that thing that bites you when it's down inside the sink and nobody can find that? It used to be a little ball and now it's a bleh, and you reach in there and it bites you because it's in pieces now. That's kind of the idea here. It is the idea she would have been washed until her skin was white, and then they would wash her and make her skin white. It's called a sephitab, and it's basically like a piece of chalk, and they would just rub it all over the girls' skins. It was meant to remove the dead skin and polish the skin until it was shiny and new. Another part of this Persian beauty secret is something called cedar, and it was to promote glossy, thick hair. It's from the leaves of the lotus tree, and so it is, if you know what a buckthorn is, it's in that family, so it's not a real nice tree. It's excellent for dandruff and will strengthen and condition the hair shaft. So not only is she having her body scrubbed, now she's going to get her head scrubbed. And during this process, it was not uncommon for girls to lose a significant amount of hair because they were being very gentle as they were doing all of this scouring. Now, she wouldn't have been bald, don't get me that, but I'm just saying, it's like when you guys had, some of you guys have raised girls. Did you dads ever brush your girls' hair? Not for very long, right? Because your mother always rescued her. Because you start brushing, because they've got these things that you have to get through, these gnats and nits. That's part of what had to be taken care of here. And it does give many benefits, but no dye. It wouldn't have changed their color. Face powder were actually white lead. that they would have used on the face. Eyeshadows were used. Eyebrows were usually thickened, or there was length added to it as if it was done today. But it wasn't with human hair. It was some form of animal that they helped attach to create thicker eyebrows. There was eyeliner. It was made from soot, or there's something called antimony powder. Saffron was one of the things that the Persian used. One Persian lady who is talking about this said that one of my most beloved ingredients is this delicate strands of saffron. Since I was a child, I have been placed in awe of this precious spice. I have seen how it can make simple rice dish go from a staple to a culinary sensation. The unusual flavor and the beautiful golden red color come from the crocus flower. It's said that it takes 4,500 crocus flowers to make up 1 ounce of saffron. Did we just add to the king's wealth? Because all these women needed this treatment. All of these women would have received these things. Saffron was a healing properties, and it would help with dryness and discoloration, dullness. She goes on to say it'll even help with your acne. So, I don't know. They talk about these black patches or beauty spots on their faces. If you wanted to hide a blemish that couldn't be scrubbed off, you'd take a little bit of this ash and just rub it on. Now you got a mole. And it's now attractive all of a sudden. I don't know how long that lasts, but don't want to know. There was lipstick. It was made from a lichen plant, kind of a breed of the ficus plant. There was colors added to the cheeks from ochre, and makeup came in little tiny compartments, just like you got today. Came on plates and all these various compartments, if you will, but they were all, you can think about what you have to do to get these things. You grind them all up. There was milk that was used. Lanolin was used. There were perfumes. Rosewater was very, very popular in Persia. It's still popular today in certain cultures. We know now of all kinds of benefits of rosewater, toner, hydrator, all kinds of skin ailments. And did you know that if you drink rosewater, you could have smooth Persian-like skin? So, hey, I'm going to start selling rosewater because that's what everybody does today, right? You come up with whatever the newest biblical thing and put a label on it and call it, oops, I'm treading where I better not. Hydration was a big part of this. And so you have to understand, it wasn't pampering for a year. It was about 5 to 6 months of just cleaning and scouring, removing dead skin, and washing and cleansing until you got through that process. Then they would move on to these ideas of creating a look. We have no clue exactly. We have a few archaeological remnants. And again, we end at verse 4 with, this thing pleased the king, and he did so. Pick up in verse 5. In Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. Now you watch this. Story upon story, validating things that have happened in other nations. Scripture lays on top of itself, and it's self-proving. It doesn't need to be proved. I always hate it when I say those words because it stands true whether or not it's proven. But it is cool when these things do come out like this. In verse 7, Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, and we're going to find out how that happened. his uncle's daughter. So she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, here we go, we don't know what they died from, Mordecai took her in as his own daughter. I've seen various productions who keep calling him Uncle Mordecai. I don't get that from the language of the text. I think it was probably some pet father name, like Daddy or Papa, or some kind of endearing name. So it was, when the king's command and decree was heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel, under the custody of Hegai, that Esther was also taken to the king's palace, into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. So Mordecai is a Babylonian name taken from the god Marduk. So everybody thinks, oh, this got a great Jewish name. It's a Babylonian name. It's Babylonian Jewish, but it's still, after that. We see a Jew named Mordecai. First time we get some nationality rising into this thing other than Persia. First time we meet any of God's people. Mordecai's name is mentioned 58 times in this book, and 7 of those times it's emphasized Mordecai the Jew, or Mordecai of the tribe. It's sometimes in newer Aramaic documents. There's some 5th century Aramaic documents that find this name. It's abbreviated MRDK for as far as our English things. So we're seeing a lot of time periods that are still validating. We're seeing that as we get down to verse 10 and verse 20, he's seemingly tried to hide the fact that he and his cousin, he and his ward were Jews. What do we know about all these people? I'm a name guy. I love etymology. So we run into some names in this list. He's the son of Jair. It occurs in Numbers as a son of Manasseh. In Judges 10, there's someone bearing the same name. It's one of the patronymic priests of David in 2 Samuel chapter 20. It's not a Benjamite name. The so-called Aramaic texts that were found in the Qumran may contain the name Yair, which is a reconstructed form of Esther's name. And the phrase, a Jew from the chiefs of Benjamin, is clear. So you run into this kind of obscure guy. Shammai, rabbinic interpretation, says that this is Shammai, the son of Gera, who would be whose? Anybody know? Who's he connected with? Yes, Saul. He would have been part of Saul's clan who supported Saul against David in 2 Samuel chapter 16. Verse 6. Verse 6 may mean that Mordecai was deported by Nebuchadnezzar along with Jehoiakim in 586 BC. Now, this is important because it does, without saying it, reemphasizes that after the Babylonian captivity, the Jews were set to go back home. They were released, they were liberated to freedom. But not all of them participated in it. Some people putting all this together says that Mordecai could have been as much as 115 years old by the time Xerxes' 3rd year, and Esther would have been 80. So that makes no sense, putting all these dates together. It's interesting that the Jews are spoken of in the 3rd person. Makes us go, okay, who did write this in that 3rd person, referring to them? Like, who had been carried into exile, and all of this language. There's all kinds of fun stuff that we could do with all of these names. I'm not going to do it. We get into verse 7, and we see this name Esther. We see this name, not a Jewish name. Hadassah would have been a Jewish name. I begged my wife to let me name my daughter Hadassah. She wouldn't go for it. She says everybody make fun of her and call her Hattie. Hey, I got Hannah. It's all good. I got Rachel. That's good. We run into her. We're not going to find out until later why the name change. Mordecai has adopted her. Adoption was common. We read about it in a lot of different texts. In Israel, it could have been an extension of the kinsman redeemer principle, where, if a father had died or a husband had died, to keeping that line. It could be an extension of that to bring people into your household. You were not just expected to take care of them, but they also would bear your lineage. They would bear your name. It would be the Esther, the daughter of Mordecai. So you're carrying more than just a name. It's actually a title included. Hadassah means myrtle, Myrtle. And by mentioning her Hebrew name first, the author is kind of trying to say, see, Esther's got her feet in two worlds. She's got her foot over here in her Jewish roots. She's got her foot over here in her Persian lifestyle that they've embraced in this area. It's interesting to think about possible prophetic symbolism. The myrtle is going to replace the briars and thorns of the desert. It's going to depict the Lord's forgiveness and acceptance of his people. All throughout the book of Isaiah talks about that in those terms, that language. And it's interesting when you think about that and how myrtle is applied to that, and how Hadassah is going to be in two worlds, but she's ultimately going to bring peace to her people, the Jewish people. There is an interesting thing about the myrtle. I don't know how many of you know much about myrtle flowers, but they actually kind of look like a star. So it's kind of interesting, myrtle, and then she becomes Ishtar or Esther, and you have that star name. And it's Esther is from the root name of the goddess Ishtar. Yep, it's right there. Ishtar was the goddess who corresponded to Venus in the Roman world. And by that reputation, you'd say she is this grand Gentile goddess and the humble Hebrew flower. So you got these two worlds just being so pushed up so that we get an idea. Esther's low status and powerlessness contrasts with the honor and power of Persia. She represents total Jewish vulnerability. She does not speak or even appear here in the story herself, but rather it's just merely introduced. It's just kind of, here you go. Suspense is a big factor in the book of Esther. There's all these, and we're waiting on the rest of the story kind of feeling. The understanding that Vashti was beautiful, we see that Esther was lovely in form and features. And Esther is described very similarly to Rachel in Genesis chapter 29, that she was beautiful in form and attractive. And the Hebrew expression here, you need to understand, she was a looker, for whatever that means. The Hebrew expression that she is physically attractive, her face is attractive, her body proportions are attractive, whatever that means, I have no clue. I don't know, because if you look down through various cultures, some are short and squatty, some are tall and thin, some are whatever. So I have no way of knowing what to tell you she was. Again, she is one of a lot of people. If indeed this could have started a little earlier than what I believe it did, a commentator by the name of Patton calculates that if the king had a different girl each night for 4 years, there would have been 1,460 different women that were competing for this role. Girls ready to sign up? Have your daughters sign up? No, not going to do that. We do get this idea that she kind of was taken There are Targum, which again are commentaries that say that she was forcibly taken. I guess this is probably about the best place to put this. Once you went into the king's harem, you didn't go back home. So if you didn't work out, you just became one of the others. You were demoted, and you may never see the king again. Maybe, maybe not. This wasn't I'm going to go and yes, there were going to be luxuries afforded them. I'm not trying to deny that they didn't have luxuries. But you don't want to miss that this was still a pretty tragic experience. I mean, from scouring pads to chalk and all this dye and all this stuff, and then all of that in hopes that your one night's going to change your world. And then you find out the next day that he moved on to the next girl. That's painful in a lot of ways. So Esther is taken into Xerxes' harem, and he's awaiting the king's choice with all these other women. It's interesting if you look back to understanding of Haggai that Esther is going to be given a favorable position in the harem. He made sure that she had the beauty treatments. He saw that she had apparently better food, very similar to what Joseph found favor in Egypt, Daniel in Babylon, here Esther in Shushan. And again, we're seeing God at work, and God can work in the hearts and minds of the keeper of the harem. Think about that for a second. God is working in the heart and mind of this man to accomplish, if you will, a beauty out of ashes kind of story. Haggai was a Gentile. His job was to make sure the king was happy with his women. He was to keep the women looking good, smelling good, acting right, so that whenever the king wanted number 364, that's who he went and got. Whatever that particular... I'm trying to be as nice as I can about this, but this is not a good scenario. These treatments and all of this favor that is... Look with me, verse 9, so you get this. Now the young woman pleased him. Esther pleased him. She obtained his favor. So he readily gave her beauty preparations. Some commentators say that he pushed her up. He pushed her up in the line to give her a place that would be more favorable. I just haven't been clicking the thing. If you want the outline, I'll send it to you. Just email me. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. And he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. This is a Gentile. He is a servant to the king, a favored servant to the king, or he wouldn't have been in the position that he was in. Being a eunuch, obviously, was an issue. But why does that come into play? Because there had to be something more going on than just physical attractiveness at this point. There's got to be something more going on. And this is where we talk about this unseen God in this story. This is one of those unseen God moments. This doesn't just happen. This doesn't just happen. It is being ordered and ordained by God. And she has been put in a place where she's moved away from the other women. Don't really know why, other than it seems so that she would have a better life then. She's given servants who are going to take care of her, going to make sure that she had kind of, if you will, the best of the best. Verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or her family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. Here's where I say Esther was submissive to Mordecai as a daughter would be submissive to her father. Dad said, listen, this situation's not good. We don't have a lot of choices here. So if you're going to survive, keep your mouth shut about where you're coming from. Now, I have lots of questions in my mind of were there any other options Mordecai could have come up with? It feels like, oh, yeah, there had to have been. Well, there was, but he already blew that. He could have gone back to Israel when he was supposed to. I would presume so. That's one of the. There's a few thoughts on that. Is that being that they were born out of the captivity of Babylon, even though they were part of the community, they were less than in some way. But yeah, I'm with you, because the king's boss guys said, get them from everywhere, get them from everywhere. The rich, the poor, the those over towards China, those over towards Greece, those down towards India. Could have been to give a wider selection. I mean, sure, there's lots of possibilities. Right. It is possible. Yeah, I mean, it does cover that area. I mean, his reign did cover down into that area. Look at verse 11, and we'll quit here. This is where you see the father-daughter relationship again. And Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. I skipped 2 words. Did you catch them? Every day, he's walking back and forth in front of the closest he can get to the quarters, and he's just looking for somebody who will tell him how Esther's doing. Somebody who will say, has it happened yet? Is she in? Is she out? Is she alive? Is she dead? Is she sick? Is she well? What's going on with my girl? And you see that father-daughter love that comes out of this. Esther may not be the quintessential love story between Esther and Xerxes, but it is a love story of a father and a daughter and a heavenly father and his people. You see that roll all the way throughout this book. It grows with anticipation, and I know everybody wants to get to the banquets. That's why everybody wants to get to. When do we get Haman on a pole? That's why everybody wants to get to. You're going to get Haman on a pole. Trust me. What are you guys? Like probably watching horror flicks on Saturday night. Just Haman on a pole. That's what we always want to get to. But it's interesting that in the midst of all of this sordid, kind of gross behavior, you have this purity of love between a father and a daughter, and the purity of love between the Heavenly Father and his people. It's kind of in contrast to this whole other world that is going on. And so we'll continue working our way through here, including a very key event for Mordecai that ends up at the end of chapter 2. It's kind of pretty important that this event happens for the rest of the story to unfold properly. Again, God's signature is all over the book, even though his name is never mentioned. Don't just keep reading it and keep looking for God's fingerprints. Keep reading this story and look at all these little details, how God is taking care of and how God is molding and how God is preparing and how God is working everything out according to a purpose and a plan. And God has always taken care of his remnant. He always has. He's going to yet again. There's coming a day Unfortunately, it will be through the process of the tribulation period where once again he will redeem a remnant of Israel. Not through Persia, through a very violent 7-year process, but through it, Israel will meet or become aware, maybe a better phrase, of who the true Messiah was. But God has always had a remnant. The promises that God made to Abraham still stand today. They didn't get done away with. So we need to don't miss the hand of God in all of this. Next Sunday morning, we are back at our 10 Commandments. I forget what number we're on. I think like 5 or 6, something like that. As we continue our study in 2 Peter or 1 Peter. We're not 2 Peter yet. Wishful thinking, right? No. I can't tell you, just real quick in closing, I got, and this is not about me, and I don't want to make it about me, but I got several texts this afternoon of people who were commenting of the process that they went through to get out of their emptiness. And, you know, it was just stories. It was just different stories. I chased after all that stuff, and God filled me. I was after all of this, and God filled me. And it's just, I say that to you as a testimony that if you're still processing this morning, just remember, God is still in the business of filling his people and still filling and helping us through that emptiness. And there is something beautiful about it. So keep pursuing it. Keep sharing your stories. I've got some things brilliant in the back of my brain on how we can get more of our stories out there. So let's pray together. God, thank you so much for tonight. We thank you for the story of Esther. We thank you for having it such a way that we really have to pay attention to see you. Sometimes we read your name in other stories and we gloss over it. Sometimes we see the works of the Lord God, Jehovah, Yahweh, and we can somewhat take it for granted. And we get into a story like Esther, and we are forced to pay attention to the God who is not always visible, but is always at work. And we thank you for that. Thank you for the times when we feel like we cannot see or hear your name, that we can have hope and we can have faith that your fingerprints are still all over our lives. Help us as we go out into the world this week. If you should tarry or return, Father, give us opportunities to talk to somebody about Jesus this week. Give us the opportunity to share our story with another believer, to encourage them on the way. Help us to be bold in our witness and not gloss over the opportunities you bring our way. Help us to be eager to have your name on our lips. Father, in this day and age in which the world gets darker and darker, which you've warned us it would happen, it doesn't matter how dark the night is, Jesus is still the light of the world, and we thank you. We thank you for your light, for your truth, for your hope. Help us to walk in it until our faith becomes sight and we're standing in your very presence. And we do cry, even so come, Lord Jesus. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week, everybody.